You don't know flag.
Thank you, Sergeant Essential. Thank you, Sergeant.
You don't know flag.
Welcome to You Don't Know Flag, a podcast full of stories about retro gaming, retro computing, video games, arcade games, and technology from a guy who was there and still is. My name is Rob O'Hara, but for the next 30 minutes, you can call me Flag.
Episode 113. Apple Computers.
Hello, and welcome to episode 113 of You Don't Know Flag. Start out every podcast nowadays with an apology for how long it's been since the last episode, so let's just get that out of the way. It's been a long time since the last episode, and this is the current episode. Episode 102 of You Don't Know Flack was inspired by the death of Gary Gygax, the founder of Dungeons & Dragons. And so similarly, this episode 113 is inspired by the death of Steve Jobs. As most of you know, Steve Jobs was one of the founders of Apple Computers. And so on episode 113, I'm going to be talking about my experiences with Apple Computers. Now, before I get started, I always have a few housekeeping tasks that I like to get out of the way. Just kind of a little rundown of what I've been up to lately. I've been doing some writing lately. I just finished a couple of articles for Video Game Trader magazine. You can check out their website at videogametrader.com. You can find their magazine at, well, you used to be able to find it at Blockbuster, I believe, but my local Blockbuster is closed down, so I'm not sure where you can find it now, but you can get it straight from videogametrader.com. So check out their site. I also just finished a couple of articles for the digital press, e-zine. Issue 71 just shipped, and 72 we're working on right now, so you can always check out digitpress.com. It's D-I-G-I-T press.com for digital press. And I've also started writing for The Retroist, which is a really, really cool retro website. The articles for The Retroist aren't really in-depth per se, so it's a little different than a lot of the things I write. Most of them are like pictures or memories and little blurbs that are just a paragraph or two, but they have a lot of posts every day and a lot of cool traffic and a lot of different writers, so you can kind of get different perspectives on retro things, a lot of 80s, 70s, even some stuff from the 50s and 60s. So check out The Retroist, which is at retroist.com. And The Retroist also has a really good podcast. It's one of the podcasts that kind of inspired me to start with my own podcast. So definitely check out The Retroist podcast as well. The big news for me over the last several weeks is that we have moved. We just put our old house on the market last week, and we have moved into a new house. It's in the same general area as our old house. We're about 15 minutes away from the old house, but we found a newer house that's a lot bigger. It's got a lot more room, and so I have my computer set up in the new house and TVs and beds, but not a lot more than that. So we're still trying to find things like silverware and pots and pans and our clothes. And I have a large storage unit full of boxes and full of most of my possessions that haven't made it to the new house yet. So we're kind of in between houses right now, but with the computer hooked up. Oh, also I just recently got a new microphone, which I'm using. This is the first time to use it for the podcast. To record before, I've had a lot of compliments on the quality of some of the old podcasts, some of my previous podcasts, and I was using professional studio quality microphones hooked up to a Behringer mixing board, and it was really kind of overkill equipment wise for a podcast. So I just recently purchased a Yeti microphone. It's a USB mic made by Blue. They're pretty good quality. They run around $100, a little bit under $100. I got mine off of Tiger Direct, but it's USB. So I was able to get rid of a lot of hardware and replace it with one single mic. And the quality is comparable. I kind of get a weird echo in this room. I think I'm facing a wall, and I think it's kind of echoing off that wall a little bit. So may have to try to tweak the settings a little bit. Maybe we'll see how it goes. Episode 113 was supposed to be about text adventures, and I actually did an interview with Rob Sherwin, who wrote and released Crypto Zookeeper, a new interactive fiction game that's really good. And to give you an idea of how long it's been since I messed with this stuff, I did a Skype interview with Rob about the upcoming release of his game, and his game has been out now for several months. So I actually still have the interview that we did on the hard drive. It's on a computer that's not hooked up right now, so hopefully I can get that machine online pretty soon and pull those files off and get that. Maybe that'll be one of the next upcoming podcasts. But in the meantime, you want to go check out Crypto Zookeeper. That's all one word. Crypto, CRYPTO, and then Zookeeper, all one word. Just punch that into Google, and you can find out some articles about the game, the review. It's available free for download, or Rob also on his website has it for sale. It's a 2-disc set, which is a really, really cool thing. So go check that out. And I think that's about all the housekeeping issues I have. So let's go ahead and get started with episode 113, My Experiences with Apple Computers. In the spring of 1980, my dad purchased a TRS-80 Model 3 computer, which was pretty cutting edge at the time. And it seemed like for a couple of years, Tandy and Radio Shack were really going to dominate the home computer market. The Apple II had been released, and the Apple II Plus had been released around that same time. But, when most people thought about home computers, they thought about Radio Shack and Tandy computers. So it really seemed like they had the market cornered for home computers, but only a couple of years after that, they really kind of lost the market. And part of that, I think, was Apple and Apple's push to get Apple computers into schools. I remember by third grade for sure for me, so 1982, 1983, we had Apple computers starting to show up in our school. And of course, I was at a great advantage at that time because, I'd had computers at home. So a lot of the teachers weren't familiar with computers, but, I was able to help them out and do different things. So I kind of became that kid that could help, teachers out with computers and do stuff like that. Now, the TRS-80 Model 3 that we owned, of course, it wasn't color. It was just monochrome, black and white screen, and it didn't have floppy disk drives. So everything that we did back then was on cassette tape. All the programs that we had, you had to load from cassette, or you could save on a cassette. And dual floppy drives for the TRS-80 Model 3 was a $1,000 option. And so around 1982... my dad started checking into buying floppy drives for the TRS-80 and found that for the same price that you could get those floppy drives, he could get an Apple II. And actually, what we ended up getting was an Apple II clone called the Franklin Ace 1000. Now, you could probably do an entire podcast about Franklin and their line of computers because it's kind of an interesting story, but Franklin Ace released several Apple clone computers. The first one was the Franklin Ace 100, which was a clone of the Apple II, and then they had a Franklin Ace 1000, which is the one that we had, which is listed as a clone of the Apple II Plus. And then they had a Franklin Ace 1200, which was same as the 1000, but it had internal floppy drives. And anyway, what was interesting about these is that now, when you think about clone hardware, you think about people reverse engineering, maybe BIOSes or, the internal mechanisms of a computer or something. But what Franklin did was they just dumped the Apple ROMs and reburned their own. So you could actually go into the ROMs and dump the ROMs out of the Franklin Ace series of computers, and you could find the names of Apple programmers in there. And so Apple sued Franklin Ace But they lost. Franklin Ace actually won the lawsuit. And so they were able to continue making the computers. But eventually, Apple appealed that judgment, and Apple won in 1988. So that's when Franklin Ace had to stop making their Apple compatible clones. But they released several other ones. There was a Franklin Ace 2000, which was an Apple IIe clone, and then the Franklin Ace 500, which was an Apple IIc clone. And then there was actually a Franklin Ace 2200, which was a 2C, but it also had a detachable keyboard, and it came with dual floppy drives. So a lot of people actually thought that the Franklin Ace hardware was more innovative than Apple's. But so anyway, back when we owned our TRS-80, we got software from one of two places. We either bought them on cassette tape from Radio Shack, or we would type them in for magazines. If you're not old enough to remember, magazines would actually publish basic programs, the code, and then you would just type them in manually into your computer and then save them on a cassette, hopefully. So when we sold the TRS-80 and went to the Apple, our Franklin Ace 1000, but for the sake of the podcast, I'm just going to say Apple. With our Apple, the world grew immediately because we had 2 disk drives. So first of all, you could buy software at a lot of different places. In my town, basically the only place that you could buy Radio Shack software or Tandy software was Radio Shack. But with the Apple, there were computer stores around town, computer stores in the mall, so there were a lot of places like that to get software from. There were also BBSs, and I know there were TRS-80 and Tandy-based BBSs, but we didn't have a modem for our TRS-80, but we did for the Apple. So once we started getting onto BBSs, you could download software. And then there were trading discs with other people, which was something that I don't really know if there was a big cassette piracy scene of people dubbing cassettes. I suppose you could. I would think that the loss of quality, generations would be very important. I don't think, because you're dealing with an analog signal, so I wouldn't think a copy of a copy of a copy would work very well. But with discs, being digital, you could just make copies and it wasn't any big deal. So another difference between our Apple and the TRS-80 was our Apple had a joystick, and that opened up a whole new world of game playing. Now, of course, there were games on the TRS-80, but the graphics, were very crude. But with the Apple, all of a sudden you have, arcade games that are being ported over to the home computer, and now you have this joystick, and Apple joysticks, unlike Commodore and some of the other ones that we had 2 different buttons. So there were several games where, like Load Runner is one, where on an Apple, with a joystick with 2 buttons, each button in Load Runner you would run around on as a platform type game where you dig holes to trap your enemies. And on the Apple, since it had 2 buttons, you could dig to the left or dig to the right. So, like when you play the game on a Commodore, the Commodore joystick only supports 1 button. So you only can dig the direction you're facing. So on the Apple, like one technique you would use would be to run away from the predators and dig behind you, leaving these trenches. But that was much more difficult on a Commodore with 1 button. Same thing with Choplifter is another game that comes to mind where you would fly a helicopter around and 1 button would spin your ship around while the other one would shoot. Well, on other systems, it only had 1 button. You had to find different ways to do that. Karateka is another one. Karateka was very good and early. It was by the same guy that did Prince of Persia. But the 2 buttons on the Apple, 1 button punched and the bottom button kicked, where on other systems, that only had a single button, weren't able to do that. So I kind of wrote a list down here just of some of the different programs, some of the different games I remember playing. Archon was a big game for me If you've never played it, Archon is a well, boy, you could do an entire podcast about Archon also, but it's basically like chess, except for when you land on a square of your opponent, you don't automatically take that piece; you have to fight them for it. And Archon was available for many systems over the years, but the Apple is the first place I saw that. Little Computer People, that was another Apple program, or that I originally saw on the Apple. Little Computer People was, of course, the Activision program where that simulated, it turned your computer into a house, and you had a little virtual person who walked around the house and lived inside your computer. The names were randomly generated, and supposedly no two were exactly the same, the combination of colors of your character and your person's name, but my guy's name was Ogden, and so anyway, it's amazing how much time back then, computer programs were so new and so amazing back then that, now you couldn't, it wouldn't seem very interesting to just watch this person walk around inside your computer, but back then, it seemed pretty cool. Now, one thing I talked a little bit about was the arcade translations, and in the early days, there were a lot of releases that weren't licensed. Like there were, lots of Battlezone and Robotron knockoffs, Pac-Man. One of the more infamous stories during that time was the release of Taxman in 1981 for the Apple II. So Taxman was, a Pac-Man type clone with some little minor details changed. They changed the ghosts into little insects and bugs and things like that, and the bonus items were changed. But, when Atari found out about it, they basically threatened to sue the people who had written Taxman. So after Atari threatened them with a lawsuit, the writers of Taxman had to submit their code to Atari, and basically what happened was Atari changed the graphics back into Pac-Man, and that became the official Pac-Man release for the Apple II. So, like I said, there were a lot of unlicensed games that were being released just by homebrew programmers at that time. Let's see, some of the other games I wrote down here. Swashbuckler was a big game. It was before Defender of the Crown, and it was kind of like the sword fighting part of Defender of the Crown. If you look it up, there's some YouTube videos of Swashbuckler, and it's not very advanced. You just had it's two-dimensional, and you had people coming from each side, and you basically stabbed them with a sword over and over. So not very advanced, but an Aztec is another one where you would go, it was this Indiana Jones type game, and you would go on these adventures, and Below the Root was another Apple game that I played a lot of. Below the Root was obviously not graphically as advanced or whatever, but the best, it was almost like that open sandbox type game, like you think of Grand Theft Auto now, where you can go anywhere and talk to people and do things or whatever. There weren't as many prostitutes in Below the Root, but there was actually a point to Below the Root, and I played that game for years, and I never knew what the point was or the goal or the object or anything. I just wandered around and talked to people and explored the trees and this area. So I also, during my time with the Apples, when I first experienced role-playing games, there was Wizardry was a big one, and Ultima also. So those type of adventures. I don't play a lot of role-playing games these days. I just don't have the time really to do it. But during that time, you have the explosion of arcades and arcade games, and computers, home computers, did not have the same graphic capabilities of arcade machines. But what they did have was arcade games were set to basically have you play and then kill you off within 30 seconds to a minute or whatever. So home computers could give a different experience, and one of the things that they could do differently were these role-playing games like Ultima and Wizardry, where you would play for hours or weeks on end, and so that was something arcade machines couldn't do. There were also a lot of applications that I remember playing with for the Apple. There was Blazing Paddles, which was an early art type program. We also had a Koala Pad, which was basically a drawing tablet. I had one later for the Commodore as well, but it seemed pretty amazing at the time. I would take pictures from magazines and try to put them on the touchpad and then trace over them lightly, or I remember having these stickers of like ninjas, and I would put them on the Koala Pad and try to trace around the outside lines of them and then color them in the art program, so the Koala Pad. There was another animation application called Fantavision, which you don't see a lot of people talking about. I haven't checked YouTube. I don't know if there's videos out there. I'm sure there are for Fantavision, but Fantavision was a cool animation program that did what it called tweening, which now is kind of like what we think of as being morphing, but obviously, much more primitive. But you could make animations by, drawing a stick person here and then moving over a little bit and drawing a shape and a stick person, and the program would fill in the frames in between, so you didn't have to draw, every frame of an animation. And so it would, come up with some really neat things that you could play with. And I can't forget Newsroom and Print Shop. Those were also big programs on the Apple. Print Shop, I know I've talked in my book and other places about printing signs and greeting cards and printing banners for kids at school. I used to charge kids, I think it was, 10 cents a letter and maybe 25 cents for little symbols, but I would print out these giant banners for kids and sell them. And then Newsroom was another thing that I had just got into, like making newsletters and things. And then eventually we in school, like in 7th grade and 8th grade, I was on the newspaper staff, and we would do layout. We would lay out an entire newspaper using Newsroom and Print Shop. So those were skills that came back, Now, as I said before, on the Apple, we also had a modem, and this is where I kind of cut my teeth on modem. My first alias was Robbie Franklin, which is a horrible alias. But obviously it comes from my first name and, having the Franklin computer. It was so bad that people would say, hey, you really shouldn't use your real name. And I'm like, no, it's an alias. But it was so terrible that people didn't know it was an alias. But so I had started calling Apple BBSs. And my dad was also calling BBSs, and that's where he met a guy named Ron. And Ron was like if you ever had that software hookup, like the guy that had everything. And this is kind of the guy that I became later on for my friends in the Commodore world. But for the Apple world, this was that guy for us. And Ron, just had everything. We would go over to his house and just, I remember my dad would take like boxes of blank discs, and Ron was happy if he got one program from us that he didn't have. And he had a BBS, and he had, all these things, like 2 computers set up and stuff. And a lot of times I remember he had some role-playing hardback books, like for D&D and some other stuff. So I would sit in the living room sometime and flip through these books while they copied programs. But Ron was a huge source of software for us back in the day. And eventually we quit seeing him because my dad moved on to IBMs. And one day Ron got rid of his Apple and bought an IBM and came over and literally copied software from us for hours, and it was really good to be able to pay him back for all the programs that we had got from him. But I have all these cool memories of the Apple. I played with the Apple at home, and I played with it at school. And then I started going over to my friends' houses, like the guys across the street, the Roarks, and my buddy Andy, and they all had Commodore 64s, which, if you've used both, I mean, Commodore graphics and sound were just so much better than the Apple IIs, and around that time you would see Apple advertisements in magazines, for a game like Ghostbusters or something, and then at the bottom it would have a picture of the graphics in the game, and it would say Commodore 64 version shown, because the Commodore version was just so much better. Commodore would do 16 colors, and Apple, back then had 4 colors, or, a lot of Apple IIs, like the II Plus, most people just had monochrome. So, and then in 7th grade, in 1985, that's when I met my friend Jeff, and he also had a Commodore. So now I knew all these people with Commodores, So that's basically, when I decided I had to get a Commodore. And my dad had purchased a PC Junior. So he had this PC Junior, and then he ended up upgrading and buying an XT. And then around this time is when my parents opened their computer store. And so some of the computers that we owned went up to the computer store, and some of them stayed at home. I know the Apple, I think, went up to the store to kind of like demonstrate software and stuff like that. And then my dad eventually traded the Franklin Ace off for a Commodore SX64, the portable, luggable, if you will, Commodore, 23 pounds. It's hardly portable, but and I can't remember if we used that for the store or what we did with that. We actually had a Laser 128 for a while, which was a Apple IIc compatible machine. But after the store closed in '86 and we got rid of our Apple, I didn't use an Apple for several years. In fact, I don't think I used an Apple again until 1991, which was the year I graduated high school and enrolled in college. And in '91, one of the college courses I enrolled in was journalism. And the year I enrolled, the journalism program was transitioning between the old style of doing layout and paste up, which involved typing up stories on a typewriter and cutting them out with a pair of scissors and gluing them where you wanted them to go with glue sticks, and doing their layout in a computer using PageMaker. And so after I'd been there for a semester, they opened up this computer lab, and they had a couple of Mac Pluses. And so people would come in and type in their stories, and I ended up being the editor of the newspaper, so I had to really learn PageMaker and learn the Mac Plus to be able to do the layout. The Mac Plus is the little all-in-one Macintosh computer. You've probably seen them. They have a 9-inch screen, black and white only. But if you wanted to do desktop publishing back then, you had to have a Mac, and so that's what we learned. They also had that was the first computer I knew that I had that you could actually record sounds on. It had a little microphone jack in the back, and you could just plug in like a Radio Shack microphone or something. So we had a VCR in the room, and we would bring videotapes from home. Like I remember bringing a videotape of Pee-wee's Big Adventure, and we would play it on the VCR and hold the microphone up to the TV and record these little sounds, like now you would just think of them as, wave sounds or whatever, but and save those to a disc. We just thought it was so cool, and so amazing to be able to do that on a computer. We even had a handheld scanner. I don't know if you've ever used one, but they were horrible. It was just a horrible technology that you could It was a scanner that had wheels on the bottom, and you would roll it. It was like a giant mouse, and you would roll it across things to scan in pictures, and the quality was terrible. But I don't know that we ever got anything scanned in that you could actually use in the newspaper. But yeah. So I used the Mac Plus for a couple of years, and then in 1993 I moved to a different college, and they actually had like color Macs, like the pizza box type maps, and they did they were using PageMaker also, so I did that, and they had this their Macs were all networked together, and they had this network game called Spectre, which was it's kind of like Battlezone, where it's vector graphics and you drive around these tanks, but it's networked, and it would be like Capture the Flag. So, it was almost like a predecessor to Doom, to where we were all running around and shooting each other and trying to get the flag, But one of the things that really, I liked Apple, and the Apple II. I mean, I have a lot of good memories about the Apple II, but around that time, I started running into all these people. I mean, I call them Mac snobs. And I don't mean that to say that everybody that uses a Mac is a Mac snob, but these people that would just look down at you if you mentioned that you had a PC at home, or if you liked IBM, or had a Commodore or anything else like that, And I remember talking to this guy who had bought one. He was like a representative of Mac that went to our school, and he kept trying to sell me a Macintosh, and it was like $4,000. And I had just put together a PC for like $500 or $600. I couldn't afford that. I couldn't afford $4,000. And of course, back then Macs had a really bad reputation for being really modular. You couldn't really upgrade them. If you did, you voided your warranty, and you couldn't get parts off the shelf like you could on PCs. That was another thing that in 94 and 95 I worked at Best Buy, and for a while I worked in the software section, and we had 11 rows of software, and 10 of them were for PCs, and then 1 row was for Macs. So, I had several people trying to get me to move over to Mac computers, but it was like, I stayed with the PC because that's where the software was. And now that's not so much the case. I mean, you can either through virtual machines or, just depending on what you want to do. There's software available for both. But that those are the things that kind of turned me away from Apple. And I really started avoiding Apple and Apple, products to the point where, when iPods came out, everybody said, oh, you got to get an iPod, and I just did not want to be associated with that mindset. In fact, I was like, I'll get an MP3 player that's any brand but an iPod. I did not want an iPod brand. In fact, I had a old Creative Labs Nomad MP3 player, which was terrible compared to the iPod Touch, or even the original iPod, but it didn't have the same features. The screen wasn't as good. The interface was terrible. But, I just didn't want to, own an Apple product. So instead, I suffered with a subpar product just so I wouldn't be associated, with Apple, with owning Apple products. I did the same thing with cell phones for a long time. When the iPhone came out, I ended up getting a Palm Trio, and then I moved to the Samsung Blackjack, not because I wanted a Samsung Blackjack, but it's just because I didn't want to have an iPhone. I didn't want to have what all these other people were doing, And then my friend Andy's kind of my litmus test for when Andy owns technology. Andy is not a technology guy. He's a firefighter. And so he's not, he has a laptop, of course, but, he's not what I would call a computer person. And so when he owns technology before I do, that's when I know I've missed the boat. Andy called me one day and was telling me about MySpace, and I was like, why are you on MySpace and I'm not, and so I got on there, and so I'd kind of, that's how I could tell that I've missed the boat on something, when Andy does it before I do. And then when Andy ended up getting an iPhone, and when I saw it, I was like, oh man, what have I been doing? Like, I've been suffering with these other, subpar pieces of hardware. And I was just really mostly amazed by the interface. You can say anything about the actual quality of the phone itself. I know that it's even here in the Midwest, we have pretty good AT&T coverage, but my phone drops calls all the time. But just the interface and the slickness of the applications, and I'm not a huge iTunes fan, but the way that they've set up their store, it all just makes sense. And so even if you're not a fan of, the company or things like that, you have to give it to them for their interfaces. In fact, I didn't even buy an iPhone for a while. I bought an iPod Touch, and then eventually figured out that the iPod Touch was essentially an iPhone, just that you couldn't make calls with it. So once I got used to the iPod Touch, I ended up buying a 3GS in the fall of 2009. It's actually the phone I still have, so I'm planning on upgrading to the 4S. I'm just waiting for these battery issues to get ironed out. Now, along the way, I also bought a Kindle, and I tried it, and I like the Kindle for reading ebooks, but I really wanted more functionality out of it, and I was waiting for the next tablet to come along, and when I saw the iPad, I was, again, I thought it was overpriced, being an Apple product, and I didn't want to be tied to iTunes, but if you jailbreak it, you're not tied to iTunes. There are other ways to copy your music over and stuff, but I just kind of waited for anybody else to come out with a tablet that was comparable, and nobody did. I mean, I got mine in the spring of 2000, and when we're just now coming in the end of 2011, and we're starting to see competitors step up, but there hasn't really been a comparable tablet, I don't think, that compares, so I don't know. I feel like as far as computers go, I feel like I'll always be a PC guy at heart. That's just where my roots are, and what I'm comfortable with, and that's what I support at work too. I do Windows Server Administration, and we run Windows desktops at work. So it's too hard for me to get away from that at this point. But especially for their mobile devices, they really have the interface down, like I said, and so I think they've kind of won me over in that. So I don't know that I've gone full circle as far as coming back to Apple, but yeah, that's pretty much my experience with modern Apple hardware, is mostly with their mobile devices. iPod Touch. I have a iPod Touch. My family owns 3 iPhones. We have 3 iPhones, 2 iPod Touches, and 1 iPad, and possibly a second iPad this Christmas. Who knows? But anyway, the last couple of things, I jotted down some notes here before I started about current Apple things. One is Kansas Fest, which just took place, but search Google for Kansas Fest, and it is a meeting of old Apple enthusiasts that get together once a year. So Kansas Fest is a really cool thing that happens on a yearly basis. And one of the things that was released shown at Kansas Fest, I should say, is the latest version of the CF for Apple II project, which is a compact flash reader for Apple II, and the newest version is actually USB, and so it's a card that you can put in a vintage Apple, like Apple, not a 2C, but anyone that took internal cards, so the 2 Plus, 2E, and 2GS. And it has a USB interface, so you can download disk images off the internet, put them on a USB stick, and then load them into the computer straight from USB. So I think that's really cool. I'm on the waiting list for the next batch of those. So I don't own one yet, but I'd like to get one of those in the near future. And then one other thing I wanted to mention was virtualapple.org. So you don't really need an emulator. If you want to check out some of the programs I mentioned, go to virtualapple.org, and it is a online Apple emulator. So you can just go to that website and pick any disc that you want to insert any of those games like Choplifter or Swashbuckler or Aztec, and it will load it up and you can play those games right there in your browser. So that's pretty awesome. I don't know, that debate has gone on forever. I don't know that emulation will ever fully replace for me the actual physical hardware, but the convenience if you're sitting at an airport or somewhere and you just want to check out some old Apple games or whatever, virtualapple.org. So pretty cool stuff. I have a built-in desk in this room that I'm sitting in right now in the new house that is mostly bare right now. It has my PC on it. It has a monitor and a printer, but I have a large section of desk, about another 6 foot, that is empty. And so I think I'm going to set up my Commodore 64 and one of I actually, I should have mentioned this, but I don't have any Apple II Pluses, I don't think. I have several Apple IIes, and I have a 2C, but I've also, off of eBay, it's not the original one that we own, but I have picked up a Franklin Ace 1000. So I think I'm going to use this other spare part of the desk here and hook up the Franklin Ace 1000. I know that the Apple IIe is probably more familiar to people, as far as that classic Apple look. But, the Franklin Ace is what I grew up with, so I think I'm going to hook that up. And I believe that CF card for the Apple II, the USB card, will work in a Franklin Ace. It should be fully compatible, so maybe I can get that up and running and start playing some vintage games again. So anyway, so that's pretty much my history with Apple. Grew up in the 80s playing Apple and got away from it, but they've kind of got me back a little bit with their mobile products. So I think that's where we'll let podcast 113 drop off. I know it's kind of a short and sweet one, but it's got the juices flowing again. Everything's working. The computer's hooked up. The mic's working. So, and I've got my little dedicated podcast space ready to go up here. So hopefully the new podcast will be flowing. Like I said, I've got one on text adventures basically in the bag. And some other odds and ends. I know that some of you guys have requested arcade themed podcasts, so there's going to be one about arcade auctions that's going to be coming up, one of the next one or two podcasts. So if you have an idea for a podcast, email me at Rob O'Hara, that's ROBOHARA at robohara.com. You can stop by the forum, which is the Gas Chamber at Rob O'Hara, or just thegaschamber.robohara.com. Or if you just go to robohara.com, you'll see a link on the right-hand side for the Gas Chamber. Come to the forum, come sign up, and let us know what you think about the podcast, and if you have ideas for upcoming shows or requests, anything like that, you can do it there. So with that, I think we're going to let podcast 113 go. Thank you guys for hanging in there. I know it's been a long wait, but I appreciate y'all sticking around. Be sure to add the RSS feed to the podcast. There's a link to that here, or the podcast is available on iTunes, so you can get it there, however you get it. Thank you for getting it. I appreciate you guys, and stay tuned for episode 114 coming soon. Thanks again, you guys, and this was You Don't Know Flat, episode 113.